Welcome back, and first, I would like to apologise for my long absence. Due to the state of YouTube and due to things I was doing outside of YouTube, I needed a particularly long break to just figure things out and get my head together. So thank you very much for your patience. Now, I didn't want to just continue with what I was doing before. So I wanted to come back with something that was an education for myself as well as everyone watching. And much to my embarrassment, I have never seen a single Vincent Price horror film. So let's fix that, shall we, with the cult classic, The Abominable Dr. Phibes. The Abominable Dr. Phibes, or simply Dr. Phibes, is described as a horror comedy, although the comedy is very few and far between. But despite that, Phibes playing an organ while emerging from the floor like he's Liberace is admittedly quite an absurd start to the proceedings. It's not a secret that Phibes is a disfigured man, so him playing the organ gives off some pretty vivid Phantom of the Opera vibes. Now, personally, outside of that, I don't see much of the reference, but I'm just mentioning it for all the Phantom fans out there. You know who you are. But as we continue, you'll see this film has a lot to answer for when it comes to inspiring another particular film series. But all in good time. It should be mentioned as well that for the entire 10-minute opening of the film, there's no dialogue, and Phibes himself won't be heard talking until 30 minutes into the film, which definitely gives off the feel of a silent film in some ways, with over-the-top music. Speaking of which, once Phibes finishes his organ playing, we see his mechanical orchestra, which he activates, conducting them for a moment. His mechanical men don't really serve much of a purpose, they're mostly here to show Phibes' technical prowess. While Phibes conducts, his loyal assistant Volnavia appears in one of her many outlandish dresses for a brief dance number. A cage is then lowered through the floor onto a car to be used in Phibes' nefarious scheme. Volnavia somehow miraculously changing costume and location. When it comes to Volnavia, people seem divided on what the character is. Firstly, she never speaks and communicates non-verbally with Phibes throughout the film, which emphasises her other characteristic of being completely devoted to his cause. Some people say she's brainwashed or under his spell, but personally, I don't feel that. She feels like a genuinely loyal disciple who believes in what Phibes is doing. Plus, there's never any indication to the contrary anyway. Anyway, let's get back to the scheming. The cage is placed in the back of Phibes' car, and Volnavia drives off with us seeing that the windows have been painted to look like Phibes is sitting in it. Now, I don't think that's meant to fool anyone. It's more of a visual clue to the audience that Phibes is trying to preserve his former appearance, subtly implying his disfigurement. We then shift to the target of Phibes' plot, a man going to bed. A skylight in the roof is opened up, and the cage is lowered into the room and then releases whatever was inside. We soon find out what Phibes has done, as the man is woken up by the fluttering of wings as he's attacked by a swarm of vampire bats. Well, they're supposed to be vampire bats. Unfortunately, that is clearly a flying fox which only eats fruit. However, at the time, that probably didn't matter much anyway. Watching it today diminishes it somewhat, but only slightly. Also, it's pretty ridiculous that the room is filled with bats, considering that the cage was only big enough to hold one bat comfortably. But considering the film is a dark comedy, was that moment of absurdity intentional? It's hard to tell, really. Once he's back home, Phibes has a little ritual performed, going into his lair beneath the organ. The man is found dead the next morning, and then Phibes places a necklace on a wax bust of the man, and its face is then melted. Now, I call it a ritual, but I'm not too sure why Phibes does it. The necklaces have significance, which we'll see later, but the melting of the bust seemingly has no purpose. Furthermore, Phibes would have had to have made the busts to then melt them. It's all a bit too much style over substance, because it may look good for the film, but is pretty much irrelevant. We then begin to follow the investigation with Inspector Trout. Yes, Trout. and they don't discover much, but we do learn that another doctor was killed recently in a similar circumstance, except he was stung to death by bees, specifically mentioning how they created boils and sores all over the doctor's face, setting up quite early the specific design to Phibes' plan. And speaking of faces, we see Phibes reconstructing his own, with a fake nose, ears and wig. But there's not much of a dramatic change to Price's face yet. He just looks like he's had too much foundation put on him. But Phibes doesn't waste any time as he's met up with his next victim, a psychiatrist named Hargreaves. Phibes has given him an ornate frog mask, and when Hargreaves refers to himself as a head shrinker, I've got to commend Vincent Price for this look.
Head shrinker.
Very few people can be so witty with just a look, and of course, Price is one of those people. The frog mask is attached to Hargreaves with a mechanical lock that slowly tightens until it eventually kills him. And yeah, with that mechanical death mask, you might be able to see how this film influenced a more modern film series that we're familiar with. Saw, I'm talking about Saw. I genuinely believe that this film had a significant impact on the creation of Saw. And it's not just that scene I'm talking about. I'll go more into the similarities as they occur. Phibes melts another one of his wax busts, and back with the inspector, for some bizarre reason, his superiors don't think there's a connection with 3 doctors dying in strange ways soon after each other, because, as he says...
Anyway, medical men die every day.
I have to think that this has been done for absurdist comedic effect, because otherwise, it's a ridiculously stupid thing to say. But yeah, we're seriously not taking the foot off the gas, as it's time for another victim. With an emphasis on comedy this time, as the victim, Dr. Longstreet, is played by Terry Thomas, one of the greatest British comedic actors, well known for playing a cad and a bounder. So of course, here, he gets to make ridiculous faces while watching a film of a woman dancing with a snake. Considering his reaction, I assume it's supposed to be pornographic in some way, which says so much about the escalation of that kind of thing from the 70s to now. Because this is the internet. Give me 30 minutes, and I'm sure I could find videos of people doing much worse things to snakes than just dancing with them. Also, like I said, Terry Thomas was an incredible actor and comedian, so the fact that he barely appears in this film is quite a shame. However, while doing some research, I discovered possibly why. Because Dr. Phibes came out the exact same year Terry Thomas was tragically diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And although he tried to work through it, it did limit his career quite significantly. Apologies for the sudden downer, but it came up in my research and I couldn't not mention it. Soon, the arrival of Vulnavia cuts the Doctor's fun short. Quite easily and without any kind of struggle, she ties the guy to a chair. And he really doesn't protest much at all, weirdly. Not when Phibes shows up, not when he readies his equipment. He only puts up any kind of fight when Phibes sticks him in the arm, which causes the necklace Phibes was wearing to fall to the floor. The necklaces are another thing that Phibes seems to be using in a ritualistic way. For example, wearing them while killing people, or placing them on the wax bust before melting them. But honestly, none of that really needs to happen at all. There's no ritual here, there's no magic spell. Phibes is doing all of this simply because he wants to be extremely overly dramatic. And honestly, if it wasn't Vincent Price, I'd probably be questioning it more. But he sells it so well that you kind of accept it. We return to the investigation as the inspector has discovered that all the murdered doctors worked for a Dr. Vesalius, whom he visits being greeted by his...
From Scotland Yard. Detective Inspector.
Weirdly voiced son. And of course the inspector tells Vesalius the situation, and he's another one who ignores it as just one of those things that happens, doctors die every day. Which I still have no idea if this is being played for laughs, because it's just so stupid. Phibes completes his next murder by draining the doctor of his blood, Vulnavia playing the violin outside. Again, no idea why, just more style for style's sake. And the inspector finally gets a reaction from someone, as Vesalius recognizes the men who have died, as they were all colleagues of his. But that's when the inspector is called to the murder, and it turns out that the style Phibes enjoys is quite counterproductive, as the doctor's maid recalls hearing the violin playing.
At 2:30 in the morning, woman.
That scene was supposed to take place at night? Now, I know it's not out of the ordinary to film day for night, but at least hide it a little bit. I genuinely thought that previous scene took place in the middle of the day. The inspector also finds the necklace Phibes dropped, which he only realises is missing when he gets home to do his weird wax bust thing. He still sets the thing on fire though. And despite the potential needle in a haystack of finding the jeweller who might have made the necklace, the inspector strikes it rich on the first try, with the guy referring to them as
"That's beautiful craftsmanship, you know."
Which is surprising, because as far as I was concerned, they were chintzy pieces of tat with all the style and sophistication of a chocolate bar wrapper. But hey, what do I know? I guess beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. The jeweller does give plenty of information to the inspector. Firstly, that the amulets are part of a set of 10, all with a different symbol. They were purchased by a lady of style, his words, and the symbol is Hebrew, so at least some of the method in Phibes' madness might get an explanation now. And indeed, the inspector speaks with a Jewish scholar, and he explains that the symbols correspond to the 10 plagues of Egypt, and the order he tells the inspector they occurred also correspond with the murders. Seems to be quite the plot dump at this moment in the film, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I just would have preferred it if it was spread out a bit, so we could avoid the lengthy exposition. Also, so we could focus on Phibes more, because he is the most interesting character here. Phibes is back in his lair, and now, rather surprisingly, after 32 minutes of the film, Vincent Price gets his first lines, as we see him hook up a gramophone to a plug in his neck, allowing him to speak. However, it's still not really him speaking, as he doesn't move his lips. And in fact, Vincent Price had his face completely immobilized for scenes such as this, to really sell the effect. So, technically, for the very first film of his I am reviewing, he never actually speaks. Not that it detracts from his performance. In fact, I would say Vincent Price is one of a few who could actually play this role and not have it become goofy. Okay, it can be a little goofy at times, but it's a dark comedy, so what the hell? Phibes has a small speech continuing the film's plot dump as he laments the loss of his wife. The inspector is back with Dr. Vesalius, and the plot is narrowed down further. Vesalius tells him that he and all the other dead doctors only ever worked on one case together, Phibes' wife, Victoria. And back in Phibes' nutty cave, it's these 9 men who failed to save his wife who he considers responsible for her death. So Phibes is killing the entire surgical team who operated on his wife. Apparently it was an immediate radical resection, which is vague, but very much a surgical operation. So, I have to ask.
Dr. Hargraves. I'm a psychiatrist, actually.
Why did Phibes kill a psychiatrist? He wouldn't have had any involvement whatsoever, so that doesn't make any sense. Also, when Phibes heard about his wife's condition, he rushed back to get there, but had a car accident and apparently burnt to death, hence his facial disfigurements. Well, now that we know what's going on, it's back to the killing. In a wooded area, Volnavia pretends to have broken down, flagging down another of the doctors. Phibes quickly knocks out his chauffeur, and then uses a device that looks at home on the set of Doctor Who to do the killing. And later in the evening, the doctor's body is found, frozen to death, representing hail. Vesalius does his own investigation work, finding an old poster of Phibes' men, and the guy who made the poster has done business with Phibes and continues to do so. So, the most logical conclusion, the inspector and him go to the cemetery where Phibes is supposedly buried, to see for themselves. However, they don't find a body, they only find a box of ashes, but the inspector remains unconvinced. And when they find his wife's coffin empty, it continues to raise questions. But no rest for the wicked, as Phibes has another murder to arrange, and this doctor seems to be a bit of a jet-setter, as he's a pilot. And Phibes doesn't seem too concerned with killing this guy, as he just watches the flight on a hill. The doctor takes off before the police can reach him, and that's when Phibes' plan is revealed, as he's filled the plane with rats, which causes it to crash quite spectacularly. The rats pretty much have the same problem as the bats, in that they don't really look that threatening. Even with the creative use of crash zooms and quick edits, it's still not that great. The film then, once again, stops dead to have another random scene between Phibes and Volnavia, which isn't that long, I guess, but it is quite pointless. It's starting to feel like this film needs a bit of padding. There are 3 left now, and the police are taking drastic measures in order to protect these people. They've decided to take one of the doctors into a sort of witness protection program to the country. However, as they are escorting him out of the building, well, this happens. What the hell part of the 10 plagues of Egypt is that supposed to be from? Oh. Apparently it's supposed to represent diseased animals. Golden unicorn, diseased animals. You know, Phibes, you're the one who came up with using the 10 plagues. If you really didn't want to use them, that's fine, we'll understand. It's clearly a struggle. And arguably the most slapstick comedic moment of the film, the police have to unscrew the guy from the wall, all while an older gentleman continues to tell them to be quiet while they do. Phibes is back home concocting his next murder scheme, and for some reason it contains a crap ton of vegetables, specifically Brussels sprouts, which Phibes is cooking and reducing them to a liquid. And I've kind of given up on questioning the way Phibes does things, honestly. The inspector goes over the security with Dr. Vesalius, confident that the nurse he's trying to protect will be safe. But despite the obvious danger of the situation, the nurse thinks it's all completely ridiculous, because no one has actually told her what's going on. So I can understand her attitude. And of course, despite the hospital being completely on lockdown, Phibes just takes the elevator with the nurse and Vesalius, I might add. Now, I get that they want to make Phibes look like some kind of evil genius who can do anything, but it's less making Phibes look smart and more just making the cops look like the biggest incompetent fools on the planet. Vesalius escorts the nurse to a room for the night, and only then tells her that she's been targeted by a murderer. But it's alright, he also tells her to take a sleeping pill, which will at least make Phibes' job a lot simpler. Phibes has found the room above where the nurse is sleeping, and for some bizarre reason, he's brought a see-through picture of a naked woman. What the hell is that for, exactly? The film acts like it's there so Phibes can accurately locate the woman below, but the fact that he knows exactly where to place that proves he doesn't need it. Besides, he's hardly stealthy when he drills through the floor. That plastic sheet image sums up my biggest problem with this film. Excessive detail in the wrong places. Like the melting wax busts, for example. It just feels like stuff added into the film at the last minute because they thought it would be cool. Anyway, Phibes locates the woman and starts dripping the green vegetable goo. He completely misses at first, making me question the need for the stencil again. But eventually he covers her in goo. But don't worry, that's only the first half of this frankly ridiculous murder plot, because he then pumps in a load of locusts into the room. While that goes on, the inspector and Vesalius contemplate which of the last 2 curses will be for him, death of a firstborn or darkness. Fortunately, it doesn't take the inspector long to realise Vesalius' son is in danger. However, Phibes has already kidnapped him. And when they check on the nurse, they find that the locusts have completely reduced her to a skeleton. Now, fruit bats pretending to be vampire bats, I can forgive. But this one really is jumping the shark. I don't think Phibes understands what makes a swarm of locusts so dangerous. They eat crops, not people. Now, don't get me wrong, locusts do eat meat. So let's say for the sake of argument that Phibes' green goo somehow helped the process along. They still managed to reduce her to a skeleton in a matter of an hour, 2 at the most. Even the domestic beetle, which is genuinely used to clean the flesh off bones, would take at least 24 hours, give or take. She'd wake up before any real damage was done, for God's sake. Sorry. This one just really pushed things into itchy and scratchy territory for me. Vesalius is back home, probably not too comforted by the inspector's reassurance they're doing everything to find his son. Fortunately, Phibes soon makes a phone call, even though he doesn't say anything, just blares the organ down the phone. When he calls back, Vesalius is given further instruction to go alone to the house. The inspector is very much against it, so Vesalius just knocks him out and goes anyway. Vesalius is let in by Vulnavia, and he and Phibes finally speak. Phibes makes a point of saying that he doesn't trust doctors because Vesalius failed to save his wife, and because doctors told him he wouldn't speak again, but he proved them wrong. And this is what the final murder will revolve around, testing Vesalius' surgeon's skills. Now, this is where the key, no pun intended, references to the Saw franchise come in, as we have our victim and someone else being tested to save their lives. We even see an X-ray of the boy's chest with a key implanted into it. The doctor has to remove the key and free his son before acid drips onto him and kills him. Now that description alone could actually be taken straight out of a Saw film. The similarity is uncanny. You even have the frail mastermind and the loyal assistant. Now, I've not read anything about Phibes being an influence on the Saw series, but if not, it's one hell of a coincidence. The surgery gets going as Phibes watches the acid slowly work its way down, and Phibes can't help but go down and mock Vesalius, telling Vulnavia to destroy everything. But considering what Phibes also has planned, I'm not sure why he would bother with that. And while doing his mocking, Phibes finally reveals his true face, tearing off the prosthetics to show his horrific scarred visage. Although, am I the only one who can't help but see that his eyes are fine, and the joins around the mask Price is wearing is quite clearly visible there? I'm sorry, I know I should lower my expectations and be more forgiving. This was a different era of filmmaking after all. Although I should say that this climax is kind of similar to the climax of House of Wax, again with Vincent Price. So maybe Phibes isn't just influencing the future, it's taking on its own influences as well. Phibes soon departs to finish his work elsewhere. Vulnavia is going mental with an axe upstairs just as the cops arrive. Vesalius successfully manages to save his son, and Vulnavia gets the acid shower while trying to escape the inspector. And the film doesn't really hang around now that we're in the climax. As Phibes reapplies his face, the cops find his hidden lair, but he doesn't really intend on escaping, as he lays next to his wife's preserved body and drains his own blood out. Why does he need to label the embalming fluid? It's not like he's got... Right. Sorry. Carry on. Anyway, Phibes replaces his blood with embalming fluid and entombs himself with his wife, evading the police, making himself the final curse of darkness. So there you have it, The Abominable Dr. Phibes. A strange film that wasn't really funny enough to be a dark comedy and didn't take itself anywhere near serious enough to be a straight horror. One thing is key. Vincent Price makes this film. Even though he technically never speaks, his presence alone makes the film more credible. And I don't think just anyone could have made this film the cult classic it is today. It had to be Vincent Price. And despite this film being made in the 70s, it has a much more modern feel to it, which certainly helps someone like me, because I didn't need to subvert my expectations as much as I would have for other horror films of this time. So that's the story of Dr. Phibes. Or is it? As barely a year later, the sequel, Dr. Phibes Rises Again, was released. So I think we'll be visiting Vincent Price again at some point. Hello everybody, thanks for watching my video. Please like and subscribe if you wish to see more in the future. Or you can click the links on the screen to 2 of my previous reviews right now. And if you wish to support the show, you can check out Deusdaecon reviews on Patreon. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.